This is a follow-up to an earlier video in which I presented the non-identity problem. Here I want to focus on the most problematic part of the non-identity problem. It concerns our obligations to future generations. Let me illustrate the problem by considering two policy options concerning climate change. Policy option 1 is to do little about climate change and let the environmental chips fall where they may. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to assume that this policy will improve our standard of living for the next 30 years, until the damage climbs to the point that things start to go downhill fast. So, people living 100 years from now will have a lower quality of life, but at least for the next 30 years, we'll be better off. The second policy option involves spending the next 30 years investing in ways to reduce the long-term effects of climate change. This will lower our standard of living. However, 100 years from now, people will be enjoying the benefits of these investments. The non-identity problem introduces the following additional fact. The policy we select will not only influence the standard of living 100 years from now, it'll influence who will be enjoying that standard of living. The policy we select will influence who meets who when they have sex, which sperm and which eggs combine, which will result in a different population 100 years from now in policy 1 versus policy 2. Now the moral question. If we choose policy 1 and enjoy a better standard of living for ourselves for the next 30 years, who do we harm? Who's the victim? The people who will be alive if we choose policy 1 have no grounds for complaint. If we had not selected policy 1, those people wouldn't exist. They were not made worse off by our choice. They were given an existence they would not have otherwise had. The people who would have been alive if we had chosen policy 2 were not wronged. Nobody has a right to be brought into existence. A woman's decision to have or not have a child, when and with whom, is their choice. Those not brought into existence by a choice are not wronged. Those not brought into existence by our choice of policy 1 over policy 2 are not wrong. So if nobody is wronged by our choice of policy 1 over policy 2, then why not choose policy 1 and enjoy 30 years of an improved standard of living for ourselves? This appears to be a perfectly legitimate option, and if it's not legitimate, why not? That is the puzzle. Some people, well, many people, in fact, almost everybody argues that there's a moral obligation to adopt policy 2. The puzzle is how to account for this obligation given the evidence that nobody is wronged by choosing policy 1. Utilitarian moral theories, at least at first glance, holds that policy 2 is better than policy 1. The population in 100 years will be enjoying a higher standard of living under policy 2, so policy 2 produces the best consequences, assuming that their higher quality of living at some point exceeds the lower quality of living over the next 30 years. But now let's assume that population 2 includes some measure of population control. Policy 1 will end up with a global population of, let's say, 10 billion people. But under policy 2, births are limited, and we end up with 5 billion people. This would be an effective way to reduce carbon emissions. So let's assume that the quality of life under policy 1 is 60% of what it is under policy 2. Now, these numbers are just to make the case easier to understand. We do recognize that some lives are better than others. You recognize, I assume, that your life could be better or worse than it is. We'll just pretend that we can put a number to this. So under policy 1, we'll have 10 billion people with an average quality of life of 60 units. This results in 600 billion total quality life units. Under policy 2, we'll have 5 billion people with an average quality of life of 100 units. This will result in 500 billion quality of life units total. Under standard utilitarianism, given these assumptions, policy 1's 600 billion quality of life units is better than policy 2's 500 billion quality of life units, so policy 1 would be better than policy 2. If there were a third policy that resulted in, say, 20 billion people, each enjoying 35 quality of life units, this would give us a total of 700 billion quality of life units total, which would be better yet. This illustrates a problem with utilitarian theories that is known under the name the repugnant conclusion. Another problem is that if we can lower the population by simply killing, say, half the population, say by snapping one's finger while wearing a magic glove, we should do so. There might be grief and sorrow for the next couple of decades, but if the greater happiness of a less crowded and cleaner world in the future will more than make up for it, utilitarianism seems to say it should be done. Anyway, I discussed utilitarianism in a different playlist. For our discussion here, I want to just note that there are problems with this option. Now, another type of response to this puzzle notes that rights violations can occur even if the victim benefits. Somebody who was abused may be able to profit from writing a best-selling book and profit from the TV and movie rights. This would not make the abuse permissible. In 1998, an individual with OCD was shot in the head. The brain injury cured his OCD and resulted in no other noticeable symptoms. This would not argue that a shot to the head is morally permissible. So the fact that somebody benefits from a policy does not automatically imply that no wrong has been done. Another type of act that fits this category is an act that profits a person but which is done without their consent. Let's assume that I like your jacket. So I take your jacket and leave behind $100, which is more than enough for you to replace the jacket. I have wronged you, even though I have provided you with a benefit. However, for this type of argument to work here, we need an example of wronging a person while providing them with a benefit of existence. The types of beneficial wrongdoing described here are not applicable to the decision to adopt Policy 1 over Policy 2. In the first type of case, the rights violation, abusing somebody or shooting them in the head is something that generally causes overall harm, even if it does not do so in the given case. It's only by chance that it produces a benefit. But in the case of adopting Policy 1, the benefit to the people who will be born is unavoidable. Without adopting Policy 1, they would not exist. In the second type of case involving consent, all people brought into existence are brought into existence without their consent, as far as we can tell. If the lack of consent makes it wrong to bring somebody into existence, then it's always wrong to have a child. And we don't have to worry about the effects of climate change 100 years from now because nobody will exist. So more work needs to be done to come up with a type of harmless wrongdoing that's relevant to our choice of adopting Policy 1 over Policy 2. A third way to respond to the problem that Policy 1 is the better option because we benefit and nobody is harmed involves a distinction between referring to somebody in a de dicto sense versus a de re sense. Whatever that means. De re means referring to somebody or something directly. It roughly means of the thing itself. So the names Joe Biden and Donald Trump both refer to specific things, specific people. This is the de re signification. De dicto means referring to somebody by description. For example, we can speak about the President of the United States. Right now, this refers to Joe Biden. But 4 years ago, it referred to Donald Trump. The identity of the person that fits a particular description can change. So now we can imagine somebody that sets up a college fund for their child long before they even have a child. In setting up the college fund, the fund is for whichever person steps into the role of my child. The parent knows the identity of the child de dicto, but has no way to refer to the child de re. So say that if some thief gets into the college fund and takes the money, that the thief has done harm to that person's child. The fact that we don't know the identity of the person who will be born doesn't change the fact that whoever that future child happens to be, the child has been harmed. So we could say that the society that adopts Policy 1 over Policy 2 is robbing whomever might exist of their future, in the same way that the college fund thief is robbing whatever child is born of their future. What we have looked at in understanding the non-identity problem refers to the people who will be born if we adopt Policy 1 in the de re sense. They are the specific people who will be born under that policy. But we could also refer to people who will be alive in 100 years in the de dicto sense. This refers to whomever will be alive in 100 years, regardless of which policy we adopt. If we use this de dicto description, that is the description people who will be alive in 100 years, then it is true that people who will be alive in 100 years are made worse off by our choosing Policy 1. And this type of harm is morally relevant. The harm done to people who will be alive in 100 years provides a moral reason to choose Policy 2 over Policy 1. The problem with this type of theory rests in identifying which description warrants our moral concern. What about the description, people who will be alive in 200 years, Or the description, people who will be alive on August 23rd in the year 3347. And what do we say about people under the description, people who exist now? There tends to be a lot of discussion about what we owe to future generations, but what makes future generations so special? Instead of asking about what we should give up to benefit future generations, why not ask what future generations should give up to benefit us? Or more to the point, what do we have a right to claim from future generations? I think I can illustrate the problem here with a time travel case. Assume that you're given an opportunity to go back in time and kill baby Hitler. Would you do it? Or actually, what's relevant here, should you do it? Now, I don't like the idea of killing baby Hitler. I prefer to kidnap baby Hitler and give him to a Jewish couple in Alaska. Still, the question remains, should you do it? Now, if you choose to go back in time, then one of the effects that this is going to have is that none of the people existing today, or almost none of them, will exist. They wouldn't have been born. If you were to go back in time, then people under the de dicto description, people living today, may reasonably be thought to be better off. But under the de re description, everybody today will cease to exist. Now, the way we are conceiving this, we have two policy options. Policy one, we leave history alone. We do not go back in time and change Hitler's future. Policy number two is we go back in time and change Hitler's future. We give baby Hitler to the Jewish couple in Alaska. The moral question here is whether there is an obligation to choose policy two. Is it morally permissible to choose policy one? If it's morally permissible to choose policy one in the baby Hitler case, then why is it not morally permissible to choose policy one in the case of climate change policy? And yet, it still seems like in the original case, the climate change policy, there's some sort of moral obligation to choose policy two. So we have a policy choice that not only influences the standard of living that will exist in 100 years, it influences who will exist in 100 years. And it's difficult to find an argument that supports the conclusion that we have an obligation to choose a better world for one population over a worse world for a different population. Who has any right to complain if we choose policy one? If policy two, the better future, is the morally better policy, what makes it morally better?